It is a great honor for me to welcome here in the Grundlagenvorlesung of the Osteuropa-Institut for the winter semester 2020-2021, Dr. Joerg Forbrig. Dr. Forbrig is the Central and East European Director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States in the city of Berlin, in the German capital. And he holds a master's degree from the Central European University in political science and a doctoral degree also in political and social sciences from the European University Institute in Florence. Dr. Forbrig is one of the German capital's most prominent experts on Eastern Europe, and it is a great honor for us here at the Osteuropa-Institut of FU Berlin to welcome you, Dr. Forbrig, and discuss about Belarus, about the developments in Belarus. So already from the title of this discussion, we are already have given some insights to the students and followers of this Grundlagenvorlesung about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about the situation in Belarus, the political, economic, and international dimensions of these protests. And this essentially leads me to my first question. So what is different in the Belarusian protests compared to other protests that we have seen in the post-Soviet space? So why have the Belarusian protests won such an important momentum in the post-Soviet space? What is your opinion about it?
Well, thank you very much for having me in the first place. To go right into your question, I think we should start from a sort of broader observation that for many years, Belarus has been an outlier in Central and Eastern Europe. For many years, it was the one country that could be characterized as clearly as an authoritarian system, even as a dictatorship. It has had this status for basically the 26 years since Alexander Lukashenko came to power in 1994. And the question here is, what made Belarus such an outlier for so many years? Why was it so different from many of the neighboring countries where we have seen democratic risings, upheaval, whether it's in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Armenia, even to some extent in Russia on several occasions? It seems that in Belarus, that sort of development and momentum was basically absent for most of the last 26 years. And all of a sudden this year, we see something erupting that reminds many people of what happened elsewhere in the region. So the question here is, why did it take so long, as it were? And I think there are several reasons for this. The first is when Alexander Lukashenko came to power in 1994, he ended very quickly a short period of democratization, of sort of forward-looking Belarus that had emerged in the late 80s and early 90s. He dialed back very quickly institutional reforms that had been implemented. He introduced a new constitution. He changed the symbols of the state back to symbols that basically were in place when Belarus was a Soviet republic. He subordinated all political institutions, the media, political parties to the extent that they existed to his power, and very quickly consolidated his monopoly on power. So in the second half of the 1990s already, Belarus was basically back in a completely non-democratic state. This is the first. This is a reform process that was aborted very quickly, whereas in other countries of the region, of Central and Eastern Europe broadly, reforms both politically, economically, socially went much further than they ever did in Belarus. The second element here is that Belarusian society is somewhat unusual compared to its neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe. It is a country with an unusually weak national identity, or at least it was a country with a very weak national identity for many years. This has something to do with the changes that the country underwent in the 20th century. It is a country that never consolidated the same kind of national independence and identity as it was developed in other countries. Even those elements of national culture, of a national elite, of an independent-minded core of society in Belarus was basically killed during the Stalinist repressions. Just yesterday, there was a very large celebration in Belarus of the Stalinist repressions, especially in 1937, where basically within very few days in October of that year, the entire national elite from culture, from academia, the intelligentsia, from Belarusian media was killed. So it was a country that lost key parts of those who stood for a Belarusian identity in the 1930s. Then the country was devastated during the war. It was rebuilt very systematically after the war. There was a strong element of industrialization, of urbanization. Many people came from other parts of Belarus to the country that had lost a quarter of its population to the atrocities by Nazi Germany. So you have an element here whereby Belarusian society never reached the same kind of level of, let's call it, national consciousness, also a national elite that you would have in other parts of the former Soviet Union. And this is something that showed for many years in Belarus after its independence. For many people in Belarus, the stronger reference point was the Soviet past. This was a very successful past in many ways because Belarus became a very modern part of the former Soviet Union. If you want to call it like this, it was a bit of a Silicon Valley of the Soviet Union.
That's very interesting.
It combined many of the very successful and modern industries of the country. It developed a very strong infrastructure. It was generally in a very good shape compared to much of the remainder of the Soviet Union. So the reference point for many after independence in 1991 really remained the Soviet Union, and not those elements of a national identity and independence that were proposed by many in the more nationally minded opposition since the late 1980s. These are typically episodes that are much further away in history. It was a short-lived Belarusian republic that emerged at the end of World War I. It was the medieval states of Belarus and Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which had Belarusian as a state language, where first publications were printed in the Belarusian language. So these elements meant a lot less to Belarusians for their identity and culture than the Soviet Union. So for much of the 90s and good part of the 2000s, there was a very undefined identity that Belarusians held. It was a bit of a mix, basically, with very strong elements still of the Soviet past. And it's really only in the last 10 to 15 years maximum that such a Belarusian identity developed, that people in the country got used to the independence of their country, that they developed a degree of pride in that country, that they saw also successes, like the Nobel Prize for Svetlana Alexievich for literature. So in order to develop a stronger identity, you need these fixed points. And it seems that especially at the initiative of independent culture in Belarus, also of academia in Belarus, this identity emerged more strongly over the last years. So, if you will, compared to its neighbors, Belarus was in a bit of a catch-up process, where Ukrainians or Georgians, for instance, have long had a very strong identity. They could answer the question very clearly who they were and what also distinguished them from their neighbors, including Russia. Belarusians had a much harder time doing this initially after their independence, and they have now developed that set of identity markers. So they can today answer the question who they are. And in my opinion, that is an important point, because before you can ask yourself as a country, as a nation, as a society, how you want to live, you have to answer the question who you are.
Who you are.
And this is a question that Belarusians can answer today. And therefore, they have shifted basically to a next question, which is how do we want to live? And this would be my third point. There is a parallel development between state and society that we see sort of breaking out into conflict today. That is, the regime of Alexander Lukashenko basically remained 20th century Soviet. It is a very paternalistic system that claims to know best what is good for its citizens, that treats people not like citizens, but basically as inferiors. That wants to regulate and even micromanage the lives of everybody in their country. It's a very paternalistic system. And on the other hand, you have a society that not only in identity terms, as I described, but also in terms of the economy in many ways modernized over the last years. There are many people who are involved with modern industries, especially with the IT industry in the country, which is very, very modern and strong and has developed over the last 10, 15 years. There are many people who have been very mobile, working abroad, whether in Russia, in Poland, in other countries of Europe. There are people who have developed basically also a material, modern sense. They are very good at using technology. They are, as I mentioned, very mobile. It's a very highly educated population. So you have a modernization on the one hand on the part of society, a very progressive development. And on the other hand, you have a sort of conserved, authoritarian, Soviet-style paternalism that has even regressed, that has become more Soviet in many respects. And what's breaking open now in the course of this year is exactly this conflict between a modern society and an archaic political regime. And this is a structural conflict that needs to be resolved somehow, because society demands that this relationship between state and citizens becomes a different one. It needs to be renegotiated. It needs to be adjusted. The government of Alexander Lukashenko is unwilling to do that. Society very strongly demands this. And that's how we ended up in the situation that we have today. Now, to round this up, it's a very long answer, I understand that.
That's fine.
But to relate this back to your question, the difference between Belarus and many of its neighbors, where we have seen democratic upheaval in the last years and even decades, is that the conflict in Belarus is primarily a domestic one. It's about the structural conflict between state and society, where it does not have the same elements of a European orientation that many in Ukraine or in Georgia demanded. So what's absent from the protests over the last weeks is any imagery that relates, for instance, to Europe. What's absent is also anything that is anti-Russian. So this is a conflict that is almost purely domestic between state and society, and that is not about the principal reorientation of the country away from close ties with Russia and towards integration with Europe, as we saw this in the case of Ukraine or in the case of Georgia, and also in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Forbrig. This is really an amazing introduction and also an amazing overview of the background of Belarusian society, history, and politics. And I would like to follow up a bit on this before we go further into what is happening right now. So, I mean, if one looks at the 1990s, Belarus has been one of the least well-performing countries in the region in terms of reforms and governance. And your implicit answer is that the question of identity has been quite important in that direction. So the Belarusian people had only a nascent identity that made them distinctive or distinct from Russia or other regions, and therefore this created lesser incentives for reform, modernization in the post-Soviet era. Therefore, the Soviet past became in some ways a convenient fallback concept that prevented the Europeanization of the Belarusian economy, the further integration of Belarus into a European region that now had not only for example, Poland, but also Lithuania, a country with which Belarus shares very strong historical ties. So identity as a constraining factor for economic modernization, this is maybe one takeaway I would take from your answer. And of course, also identity an absence of a coherent and a consolidated identity as a factor, a negative factor for transition, both political and economic. So, and exactly. So on the one, so you're describing this very interesting disrupted picture. On the one hand, Belarus in the 70s and the 80s at the forefront of Soviet modernization, and at the same time in the 90s, something happens, and many people speak about Belarus as the last dictatorship in Europe. Many people speak about Belarus as the North Korea of Europe. So what is really happening? So you partly answer it, but I think it would be interesting to explain a bit this disconnect, this disruptive picture of Belarusian politics and economy in particular between the before and after of Soviet collapse. So does it have to do only with identity, or it is a personalistic regime of Alexander Lukashenko that contributed also to this?
Well, I think the one thing that I would add here to what I said before, and it will certainly go in the direction of an answer to your question, is that not only did Alexander Lukashenko basically preserve or reinstate an authoritarian system, but he also preserved, by and large, a Soviet-style economy. There's never been a major wave of privatization in Belarus. The state kept more or less full control of at least 80% of the economy, which includes many very large enterprises, which still resemble in many ways Soviet enterprises. They are not just places of production of particular products, but they're also places of social welfare. They cater to social needs of workers and their families. So you still, in many ways, have a Soviet style economy, even though many of the enterprises are, or at least some of the enterprises, are quite competitive on the world market. You have an enterprise in Soligorsk which produces potash, a fertilizer component, Belarus Kali, which is one of the world's leading companies in this area. You have some specialized chemical and engineering companies that are very successful actually on the world markets. But overall, what you have is a structure of the economy where the state holds the overwhelming majority of ownership in the economy, and also directs obviously the economy to be performing not just productive but also social welfare functions. And this combines with a system also of contracts in an overwhelming part of the economy whereby the state can basically reinforce a sort of social contract that basically says, okay, we provide you with employment, we provide you with social welfare, even if at a modest level, but what we expect from you is political acquiescence. So as soon as you turn critical or even hostile to us as a government, we will make you feel the material pinch. We will fire you from your job. We will reduce the social welfare provisions that there are. So there is a redistributive and coercive element in all of this, whereby the government of Belarus can use its overwhelming ownership of the economy to reinforce political acquiescence of citizens. Now, this element is important because there's also 20% of the economy that are not state controlled. Some of these are individual entrepreneurs. Some of these are companies in the IT industry that has developed quite strongly over the last years. And exactly here that you see also some hotbeds of current protests, because these are people who are not as dependent on the state for material provisions, employment, social welfare. So the first sort of aspect in all of this is that the state is able to use its ownership in the economy and redistributive mechanisms to basically keep at least a part, or for a long time was able to keep a large part of society in line with its own politics.
Thank you very much. And so essentially you are describing a much more top-down political system, so a system that is not so much decentralized by different styles of oligarchs. So styles of oligarchs, for example, like the Silovarchy tradition in the Russian political system, or the role of, which is essentially a conflation of security service officers and businessmen in strategic sectors of the Russian economy, or, for example, just the role of oligarchs in the Ukrainian political system, which we have seen also we have been seeing quite extensively in the last decades of transition, which also partly explains the reason for the Ukrainian situation. So in Belarus, you have a more central planning-like economy where the state is essentially the common denominator of everything, and there is no essential diffusion of political power in any major business sector. So a much more traditional, much closer to the Soviet prototype, which also explains the type of repression that we have been seeing today. So this essentially leads me to the elections. And why? I mean, it's not the first time, one could say, well, it's not the first time that fraud has been taking place in Belarus. Why this time is different, or has been different than other instances of fraud in Belarusian elections?
Well, there's a number of reasons here, and some of these are more short-term and others are more long-term. Let me start with some of the long-term ones. I mean, the long-term one is, I mentioned earlier that a degree of Belarusian identity has emerged over quite some years now that were absent before. So I think there is a different mindset that people have developed over the years. The second, equally long-term, is that the economy that I described, a very successful one in many ways during the Soviet days, and one that remained to the overwhelming extent in the hands of the state for the last 26 years, is also running out of steam. This is an economy that lacks investment, that lacks modernization. If for many years the Belarusian economy, at least in some parts of it, was still benefiting from a very solid substance that had developed in the Soviet Union in terms of technology, in terms of the products that were coming out of it, then the lack of investment, the lack of also access to markets other than the Russian market in particular, basically reduced the capacity and the performance of this economy, which has become less and less, let's call it, profitable in its performance, which also means that this obviously reduced the revenues the state was drawing from this economy. And even though the Belarusian leadership has been quite inventive in finding new sources of revenues, this lack of modernization in the Belarusian economy is one that I think is coming to the fore more and more in the last years. And one way of compensating for this lack of modernization economically has been a strong reliance on financing from the outside. Belarus has been heavily subsidized for many years by Russia in particular, by way of cheap imports of oil and gas, also by way of loans that it received either from Russia directly or within the Eurasian Economic Union. So there is a stronger and stronger reliance on additional resources, subsidies and loans from outside of the country in order to keep the system and the economy afloat. And a lot of these material aspects have been put more and more into question in the last years. And this is where we come to more short-term sort of impulses that led to the situation today. The first is Russia is increasingly unwilling to subsidize the regime of Alexander Lukashenko without getting something out of it, as it were. So for the last 2 years, Russia has been pressing very systematically and openly for a closer political integration of the two countries in exchange for its continued subsidization of the Belarusian regime. Alexander Lukashenko is unwilling to go further in the direction of integrating Belarus and Russia more closely. He's been long sort of opposed to a full materialization of the union state of Belarus and Russia, which exists on paper for over 20 years now. Formally, the countries are joined in a union state, but as I said, it remains on paper. Alexander Lukashenko has never made much in the way of concessions to deepen this integration and make this a real union state. Now, Russia has, for the last 2 years, been pressing for this further integration. Alexander Lukashenko continues to oppose it because he knows that this integration undermines his absolute grip on power in the country. And what Russia then did in return is that it basically questioned more and more its financial and otherwise supports to the country. In the beginning of this year, it froze oil and gas deliveries to Belarus because Lukashenko was not moving on some accounts of political integration. So the first shock in the beginning of this year was an economic one, because the revenues that the Belarusian regime lives off dropped sharply in the beginning of the year, and they had to dip into their very limited financial reserves that they have. Just to illustrate the size of the Russian subsidies over the years, is that they were sort of fluctuating around $7 billion a year. That represents about 30% of the Belarusian state budget. Its reserves are on the same scale. Belarus at the beginning of this year held reserves of about $7 billion. So if Russia steps in here and all of a sudden does not provide these subsidies anymore, especially in the form of cheap oil and gas, then Belarus has a major problem. And that was the first problem that emerged in the beginning of this year. The second impulse was that Alexander Lukashenko, in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, basically canceled the social contract that for many years was in place, whereby he basically said, I provide you with stability, I care for you, Belarusians, in all respects of your lives, and in return for that, you keep quiet and you don't oppose my absolute rule. In the course of the pandemic, he basically called off that promise. He basically denied that there was a threat. He called it a psychosis. He suggested to people to drink some vodka and go to the sauna for to be protected from the coronavirus. And people felt this is wrong. There is a threat here. We see people dying. We see people getting infected. We see that our hospitals are not able to deal with this situation anymore. And we have a leadership that basically says there is absolutely no problem. This is wrong. And what people did is they basically mobilized from their end in self-defense. They self-organized, they collected support for most vulnerable groups, for medical workers, in order to defend themselves from this public health threat. And this was basically a moment where society understood that the state is not there for them. It has abandoned them. If they don't help themselves, then nobody is going to help them survive this pandemic. So Corona was the second sort of short-term impulse that emerged here, whereby society from the bottom up basically mobilized in order to avert the worst of the pandemic. And the third element then was in the beginning of May, Alexander Lukashenko called presidential elections. They are regular elections. They aren't called particularly early or late. The last ones took place in 2015, so it is a regular cycle. But he called these elections in a situation when society was, because of COVID especially, very, very dissatisfied. And the mobilization that society in Belarus had basically developed in response to COVID directly translated into political mobilization towards the presidential elections. So many of the initiatives that had emerged to support each other against Corona basically also turned into political campaigns. And one thing happened in this, in the run-up to the presidential elections this year that we didn't see to the same extent in the past, or to some extent never saw in the past. That is, that candidates or individuals, personalities emerged that were very promising in challenging political power of Alexander Lukashenko. In the past, you had candidates typically, or opposition candidates typically coming from a very small circle of a nationally minded, European minded opposition. People who had perhaps some of them been politicians in the early 90s when before Lukashenko, who had survived until now, but people who were not particularly known to the broader public, or who didn't have sort of credentials that made them electable to many in Belarus. And this year, for the first time, you had people, and several people, with very strong credentials. You had two people emerging as potential candidates in the elections who came from the apparatus itself, who came from the business and political elite of the state. This is something that didn't happen in the past, with one minor exception. But for the first time, you have people who emerged from the elite that also indicated that many in the elite and the state apparatus in Belarus are not satisfied with the status quo and don't see the status quo as sustainable. So you had one former diplomat and director of an IT park in Belarus running in the campaign. You had another one who was a long-term director of a large bank in Belarus, also a patron of Belarusian culture for many years. So you had two people who were not only coming from the elite, but also had sort of traction amongst many in the state apparatus, amongst many of the urban, more educated Belarusians that there are. The other very promising candidate was a blogger, somebody who basically traveled around the country and gave a platform with video clips to people who were dissatisfied, who were unhappy about the low level of pensions or the low level of services in the regions of Belarus, in smaller towns, in villages. And this is interesting because this blogger, Sergei Tikhanovsky,
the
was
husband
very
of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya.
yes, he was very successful in mobilizing the core electorate of
Very
Alexander
interesting.
Lukashenko against Alexander Lukashenko. So you had elements coming together here, whereby you have a society that is sort of already strongly mobilized because of COVID and switches that mobilization and the networks, the activities that emerged away from COVID and towards the presidential elections. You had a set of candidates that had strong traction in parts of Belarusian society that were always either supportive of Alexander Lukashenko, like many in the regions of Belarus, or that were passive, like the elites of Belarus. And all of a sudden, you have a momentum here where not only those who have long been critical of Alexander Lukashenko and his regime, but also people who lived of this regime in the elites in rural parts of the country turned against him, and that made for a very strong momentum. Indeed, a novum that we haven't seen like this before. Now, to round this off and to get back to also Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, as you mentioned her, is none of these candidates. Neither the two from the elites, Valery Tsepkalo and Viktor Babarika, excuse me, nor the blogger Sergei Tikhanovsky were actually registered as candidates. They were arrested in May and in June. Two of them, the other one was sidelined and smeared in the public media, but none of them was allowed to run in the elections as a candidate. And when, as the first of them, Sergei Tikhanovsky was arrested, allegedly because he aggressed policemen at a rally, his wife decided to step in for him. She had never had any political exposure, public exposure. She was the wife of a well-known blogger, but really only minded the household and the children. She stepped in basically out of private care for her husband, and surprisingly enough, she was registered. And soon thereafter, she and two women from the other two promising candidates, Babarika and Tsepkalo, the wife of Tsepkalo, Veronika, and the campaign manager of Babarika, Maria Kolesnikova, they decided to join forces and to develop and run a joint campaign. This again is a novum in Belarusian opposition
Exactly.
politics, if you will, because never in the past has the opposition really been able to agree on a joint candidate. Now, these three women managed what generations of male opposition politicians didn't manage, and this certainly also came as a surprise to the Lukashenko regime. But it made this campaign so strong because it combined the elite electorates, the rural electorates, those traditionally critical of Alexander Lukashenko, and obviously, in particular, women and young people. Because what you had, and I'll round this off with that, is you also had an almost pictorial contrast between what this conflict is about. On the one hand, you have Alexander Lukashenko. You all may know how he looks, a former collective farm boss who's been running the country like a collective farm, basically, who even looks very archaic and behaves in very machismo, archaic ways. So you have a very old image and candidate on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have three challengers, three women with a very modern outlook, also a very genuine and modern appearance and language, who challenge him. So even the images of these two contenders, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her colleagues on the one hand, Alexander Lukashenko on the other, sort of it symbolizes the conflict that I described earlier on between an anachronistic state and a modern society.
Thank you very much, Dr. Forbrig, Jörg. But here comes to me a very interesting contradiction in mind. On the one hand, the relationship to Russia, this concept of союзное государство, this federal state that includes both the Russian Federation and Belarus, has been the very reason why Lukashenko has stayed in power for so long. So this promise to Russia, this gradual but persistent integration of Belarusian economy to the Russian Federation has been the main reason, or one of the main reasons, for Belarusian underdevelopment and authoritarianism. But on the other hand, we see here that Russia is quite undecided what to do with Lukashenko. So on the one hand, they supported him up to now, but on the other, and actually, for me, it was a very interesting thing to see that on the one hand, they were not really open about supporting Lukashenko when the protest started, but on the other hand, we saw half of the Russian government being in Minsk when the protest became much more massive in order to declare some form of support and essentially force Lukashenko to agree to their terms. And this was essentially continued in the meeting that Lukashenko had with Putin, if I'm not mistaken, in Sochi, in the Black Sea, as the protests also quite developed. So what is essentially the Russian position about Lukashenko and the way they want to deal with this protest? Because here, there is no any obvious outside or external enemy image, defined build that the Russian media and the Russian elites proposed and promoted in the case of Ukraine or Georgia. But it's really a European-American agreement, take these countries from the sphere of Russian influence. In Belarus, we don't really have that thing. So how is this going to affect the future of Lukashenko, and why why is the Russian position so divisive and not straightforward?
Well, first, I would just simply or very quickly say, before I get to this question, that the union state of Belarus and Russia is not the reason why Alexander Lukashenko stayed in power for so long.
Okay.
His power predates that union state. It was his hope in the days of an aging Yeltsin that he may succeed Yeltsin, basically, in a way, as the head of the union state. So that formal piece, very much on paper, of a state entity that's called the Union State of Belarus and Russia, has never had much significance until about 2 years ago, when Russia decided to revive the idea of the Union State in order to put pressure on Alexander Lukashenko. So let's not overestimate this entity, because there are other integration mechanisms that Russia has forced over the last years, whether it's the Eurasian Economic Union, whether it's the organization of a collective security treaty, sort of anti-NATO, that was created. So these are actually more important because they also include other neighbors of Russia. Now, when it comes to Russia's positioning towards Lukashenko and towards these elections, then it's worth keeping a couple of things in mind. The first is there is no love lost between the Kremlin and Minsk. Alexander Lukashenko is an extremely difficult partner. It's a partner that the Kremlin feels has never fulfilled any of his promises, whether these were promises for privatization to Russian capital of major Belarusian assets, whether it was politically for the acknowledgement of the Russian annexation of Crimea, which Alexander Lukashenko never delivered. So I think the Russian elite knows perfectly well that Alexander Lukashenko is not certainly not an easy partner, but is also not a very reliable partner. They rather feel that he's a very expensive partner because Russia subsidizes the country and his regime at a very significant scale, without Lukashenko ever having delivered on any of Russia's demands. And for that reason, I think, since we were talking about the Union State as a piece of paper was revived some years ago by Russia in order to pressure Alexander Lukashenko into more concessions towards Russia. I think their original, or the Kremlin's original scenario for this year's elections was to have Alexander Lukashenko weakened. I think the Kremlin started itself by freezing oil and gas deliveries in the beginning of this year. They may even have supported sort of a favorable portrayal in the media, in the social media included, by some of the contenders that were challenging Alexander Lukashenko. They certainly had a scenario in mind whereby they thought Alexander Lukashenko needs to be weakened by these elections in order to be weak enough to make concessions to Russia after the elections. So I think their original scenario was Lukashenko stays in power, but he's weakened by the elections because there is a lot of social discontent in the country. I think what the Russians did not have on their screens was a scenario whereby the political survival of the Lukashenko regime may be in question, where there is such a strong social discontent and mobilization that it may actually topple Alexander Lukashenko's regime. But this is what's basically emerged as a very serious option with election day, with the protests that emerged, with the inability also of Alexander Lukashenko, even by using all the force that he has in his security apparatus to suppress these protests. So initially, and I'm saying this this scenario must have been unexpected for the Kremlin, because the initial responses by Russia, by Russian politics, by Russian media to what was happening in Belarus were very, very mixed and ambiguous. On the one hand, you had Vladimir Putin congratulating Alexander Lukashenko on his victory on the day after the elections. But on the other hand, you had very senior Russian policymakers speaking out very critically on Alexander Lukashenko's elections, on the police violence that he employed. There was a range of very senior Russian policymakers who basically said something very different than what Vladimir Putin said in his congratulatory note. We also saw a very strong coverage in Russian media by the protests, by police brutality, again sending a very different message than Putin's congratulations on the Belarusian developments. And this typically is a sign that there was no guidance. If you look at the media coverage of Belarus, there clearly was not the typical guidance that you have by the Kremlin to media in Russia to cover events in this or that way. So for the first couple of days, you had a very ambiguous picture, and this is the strongest indication yet that we have that the Kremlin was taken by surprise. And when they eventually sort of looked at the situation and determined a position of the Russian Federation towards those developments, we see that they mobilized some form of support. Alexander Lukashenko called, within days, he called Vladimir Putin 3 times, requesting support in a situation where he, as he described it, is under assault by the West. That this is all a coup d'état that is being staged by Western countries. So he elevated this onto a geopolitical plane in order to get Russia support him. Because in the first week after the elections, the system of Alexander Lukashenko was basically imploding. It was a matter of days until there was not going to be anything left of his regime, and I think the Kremlin saw that and provided enough support to Alexander Lukashenko to stabilize the situation and the regime. They voiced political support. They announced even that they could, if needed, provide security support, military, police. They dispatched a number of media workers to the Belarusian state media, where there were strikes, where there were a lot of people leaving, journalists leaving the media. They also announced that they would provide some financial support. And this helped, this positioning of the Kremlin about a week after the elections, helped stabilize Alexander Lukashenko and his regime. It was enough support to prevent the more or less imminent implosion of the regime, but it was not enough support necessarily to have it survive in the long run. And this is the situation exactly in which we are now. The Kremlin is not clear, in my opinion, about how they want to see the further development of this situation. They are not married to Alexander Lukashenko staying in power. They can well imagine another scenario. Their problem is that they don't immediately have another scenario, that they don't see another person who would be a reliable guarantor of close relations between Belarus and Russia. So at the moment, what they're doing is they're buying time. They're supporting Lukashenko to stay in power, but not necessarily in the long run, but only for as long as Russia has not entirely made up its mind in this situation and doesn't have a clearer scenario for themselves. So this is by and large the situation in which we still find ourselves. I think Alexander Lukashenko understands that he cannot 100% count on Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin supporting him forever. If you look at the pictures coming out of the personal meeting in Sochi, the only meeting Lukashenko and Putin held since the elections, then you will see an Alexander Lukashenko that is literally begging Putin for help.
Yes.
While you have a Vladimir Putin sitting in a very manly and bored pose in his armchair, basically using a body language that indicates, you have to show me something. You have to show me that you can actually stay in power. And I think the message of the Sochi meeting at the time was, I give you some more time to consolidate your own power if you manage to do that. Otherwise, we will have to think of a different option. And I think that is a principal position that has not changed. I think there still is various options for the Kremlin to interfere in this situation. They can do this constructively by supporting some form of dialogue between the Lukashenko regime and the opposition. There's no indication so far that they are going for this option. There's obviously also always a more negative option, and unfortunately, we've seen this elsewhere in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Georgia, that Russia employs some form of hard military option to regulate the situation. I believe that Alexander Lukashenko knows that these options are on the table. Um, in that sense, the situation here remains open. Last point on all of this is, I think we always have to keep in mind one thing, that is, Russia is, in looking at its neighbors, always also looking at itself and thinking about itself. A close a system in Belarus, the system in Belarus basically resembles politically the system in Russia. Russia is an authoritarian system. It is close to a dictatorship, no less than Belarus. It's a political system that is cut from the same wood. The Kremlin always supports authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, wherever in the world, because it sees itself in a civilizational conflict with the West, with democracy, with liberal values.
We see that in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict to some extent.
To some extent, yes, but I think
extent. That's a
yes.
different story. But I mean, for me, it was a complete surprise how Russia really changed and disqualified its security commitments to Armenia in this recent conflict.
Yeah, yeah.
But this now changes again in some direction.
Yeah.
But
in that sense, it is a good indication, and it basically sort of substantiates also what I was going to say, which is that Russia eventually also has next elections coming up. Russia is also run by somebody who has been in power for a very long time, 20 years in the case of Vladimir Putin. They always think about the effect that developments in a close neighboring country like Belarus has on Russian society, Russian politics, and they will always tend out of instinct. They will tend towards suppressing any form of democratic movement because they fear that at some stage this may gain traction also in their own country. So, out of self-defense, the Kremlin at the moment is compelled basically to side with Alexander Lukashenko until they have another authoritarian option, as it were. The second part to this is obviously that Russia thinks of itself as a superpower. It has very few means to substantiate that superpower status. One of the means that they feel they absolutely need is a sphere of influence, is countries that are basically in their neighborhood and not fully sovereign. They consider the countries of the former Soviet Union that space, that sphere of influence, and they will limit the sovereignty of neighboring countries by all means. They're doing this in Ukraine, in Georgia, they're doing this in Central Asia, and they will do this in Belarus.
Even in Cyprus.
Precisely. And for that reason, the geopolitical argument that Lukashenko brought up, this is a Western coup d'etat. This is an attempt by the West to tear away Belarus from its close relationship with Russia. This argument has a lot of traction in Russia because of this self-perception as a country that needs and deserves a sphere of influence, of which Belarus is a very critical part.
And this actually leads me to the two last questions that I have. Thank you very much for this very detailed answer. So the one question would be, so we discussed about the role and constraints of Russian policy in Belarus. What about the Western countries? What about the European Union, and more specifically Poland and Lithuania, that have been quite active as into this I wouldn't name it conflict, into this series of protests. Several Belarusian oppositional figures have gone to the Baltic states. So what is the role of the European Union and in particular Poland and Lithuania in this conflict as events unfold? And my second question at this point would be, what is your estimation? I mean, I know it's very hard to make any accurate predictions, but could this whole thing end up in an elite style, Kremlin style replacement of power, and therefore the struggle of the people is essentially betrayed? Or do you think that this protest can really have some lasting political effect on who is going to be the next leader of Belarus?
Thanks. These are two questions that will take longer answers, but I'll try to be shorter than I was
Yes.
in my previous answers. On the first question, what is there that the EU, the West broadly can do? Now, first of all, let's acknowledge that the response by the EU in particular has been quite swift and quite strong. Already on the day after the elections, there were strong statements, also condemnations by many in the EU, all the way up in the EU and also EU member states leaderships, condemning not only the fraudulent conduct of the elections, but also the police violence that was employed afterwards. And this has led over the weeks to quite a comprehensive response, I would say, by the EU. So within days of the elections, you had a Foreign Affairs Council, a meeting of EU ministers, EU foreign ministers devoted to Belarus. Very quickly, you had an EU summit on Belarus. With quite some delay, but still the EU has put in place sanctions against a number of people in the Belarusian leadership who were in charge and are in charge of the fraudulent elections and the police violence. There's then also some material support that the EU has rolled out to help victims of political repressions, to help civil society and independent media. So on the EU side, there were quite a number of responses over the last couple of weeks since the elections. Two countries obviously deserve to be particularly mentioned here, two neighbors of Belarus with Lithuania and Poland, who have also bilaterally rolled out very strong forms of support. They have established humanitarian corridors for people who come under pressure from the regime in Belarus to leave the country. They have established scholarship programs for students who are being thrown out of universities.
Exactly.
They provide media or support to media outlets in order to inform Belarusian society about developments. They have put in place pretty comprehensive support packages in order to respond to the situation. And I think we have to sort of acknowledge here that this also is a very large scale humanitarian disaster. As of today, there are over 16,000 arrests since the beginning of August. There are hundreds of cases of documented torture and abuse in police custody. There are thousands of people who had to leave the country in this situation. There are over 100 political prisoners, officially acknowledged political prisoners, in jail at the moment. There are thousands of people who have been fined, who had to pay money to the state, even for their days in jail. You have to pay for that in Belarus. So jails in Belarus are a sort of hotel rather than in
You have to
Western
pay
countries.
to be in jail after you're arrested?
Yes, you pay for your jail terms.
You pay for your unbelievable.
So there is also a very large scale humanitarian disaster that will be with us for some time, because many people who have suffered through those repressions need rehabilitation, they need legal assistance, they need medical help, material help. Striking workers need to be supported. Students from universities need other places to study, abroad or not. Lithuania and Poland have been sort of pioneering some of these humanitarian responses. Other countries have followed suit: the Czech Republic, Latvia, Slovakia, Germany at the moment is discussing a support package for Belarusian society. So overall, even if some of it has been slower in the making than we would have expected, the EU has found responses here that are quite substantial. And I think we can be hopeful that there will be more of that. Now, the problem with all of this is that the EU knows perfectly well that its leverage over the situation in Belarus is more limited. It does not have the same kind of leverage that the Russian Federation has in Belarus. Belarus is very dependent in many ways on Russia in economic terms, in energy terms, in the media field, politically, institutionally, in people-to-people relationship terms. So there is a very asymmetric leverage that Russia holds over Belarus that the EU cannot match. The EU can provide a lot of support to Belarusian society, even though Lukashenko's regime is trying to limit that support as much as they can. The EU can put out political declarations. The EU can even promise that if there was a peaceful resolution to this conflict, that it would help with generous macroeconomic stability packages, which Belarus will need. So there are some forms in which the EU can help. But it also acknowledges that its means of support are much more limited than those of Russian interference are in Belarus. The one thing that I think the EU can hope for in many ways is that for Lukashenko himself and for Belarus, a one-sided dependency on Russia is also not a good thing. It is something that limits their development options. So over the last years, there was a diplomatic and political thaw between the EU and Belarus, exactly on that basis, because Belarus wanted to avoid an over dependence on Russia only. They tried to diversify their international relations, including better relations with the EU. This is something that remains in place. Out of self-interest, Belarus also needs a strong relationship with the European Union. But this will not immediately help to resolve the crisis. At the moment, we do have to acknowledge that Russia holds most of the cards. If the EU really wanted to sort of more strongly influence the situation in Belarus, and positively so, then it would have to put pressure not only on Belarus and the leadership there, on Alexander Lukashenko and his regime, but basically also on Russia and the leadership in the Kremlin. But as far as we can tell, no one is willing to
This
do
is
this
not
inside
happening.
of the EU at the moment. Now, for your second question, you have to quickly remind me what it was.
So the second question is the end effect of these protests. Will we see a change, regime change, or maybe political change, or it will just be some Kremlin-style replacement at the top, and these very impressive democratic revolutionary protests will have no effect? What is your prediction? I know it's not easy to predict, but maybe some intuition about this.
Well, first of all, the developments of the last months have already had a very, very strong effect in many ways. The first is that Belarusian society emerged. It's almost a civic nation building process that we saw. So there is a collective experience that this society has gone through that will not disappear. This will stay with Belarusians until the rest of their days. This is a remarkable collective experience that you don't forget. So what we already have here is basically a very strong impact of the last couple of weeks for many years to come on Belarusian society. The second thing that we already have as an effect is that Belarus emerged on the mental map of many people internationally. Until the developments of this year, Belarus wasn't really on the map of many people here in Germany. This wasn't really a country that that people knew about, had any basic idea about what it was and how it looked there. I think the also strong media coverage of the last couple of weeks has already put Belarus on the map of Europeans, to the extent here in Germany that the language of talking about the country has changed. Nobody talks about Weißrussland anymore. People talk about
Exactly.
Belarus. So
Exactly.
you see even in the public discourse how these developments have left their traces already. And I think these are two things that are not going to go away. The second part to my answer is that I described very initially how this is a structural conflict between a modern society and an outdated political regime. This relationship will have to be renegotiated. At the moment, we have a standoff between these two sides, and nobody knows how this is going to be resolved. But even if the Lukashenko regime managed to somehow pacify the situation, ban expressions of protests from the streets, the feeling of being more modern, more peaceful than this outdated, violent regime will stay with people, whether they sit in their kitchens, whether they discuss things at their workplaces. So this is not going to go away. There has to be, at some stage, a form of renegotiation and recalibration of the relationship between state and society in Belarus. Unless, I mean, you can freeze the status quo, but unless you resolve this conflict, you will never get into a situation of some form of sustainable, stable development in the country. So um, simply in structural terms, it is impossible to go back to the old social contract and sort of cold peace between a paternalistic regime and a passive society, because the society has discovered that it doesn't have to be passive. It doesn't have to accept everything that comes from the state. The third part to my answer here is we don't know how the situation will evolve and how how it will pan out eventually. I mean, I think we should, in thinking about possible scenarios, keep a number of things in mind. The first is what we said also initially in this conversation, that let's be careful comparing Belarus to other countries in the region, to developments as we saw them, for instance, in Ukraine and then in Georgia. Belarus is a very specific case here, and the country will probably not take the same course of development. If anything, we should probably think a bit more broadly, also in history, about other examples that may be informative. To give you an example, it may make sense to see Belarus in a similar light as Poland in 1980 and 1981, where you had a very strong upswell of social mobilization, including obviously many workers, but not only.
Not only,
And
yes.
where the only means for the regime of Wojciech Jaruzelski at the time to pacify the situation was the introduction of martial law, which also averted an intervention by the Warsaw Pact, by the Soviet Union. It is perfectly conceivable in Belarus today that eventually, and we see elements of this in place already, that eventually the only way of Alexander Lukashenko's regime to control this situation is really some form of state of emergency. Some elements have been put in place already. Um, the second element that relates to the Polish example is that Alexander Lukashenko also wants to avert an interference by Russia. He knows that he has to get the situation under control without an open interference by Russia. So, in thinking about scenarios, I think we should go much further than the often quoted comparisons these days with Ukraine and other countries in the region. Now, last on the two broad scenarios that I see. One is that in one way or another, some negotiation about the status quo and the further development and the relationship between state and society in Belarus takes place. How to initiate this, how to format this, nobody knows. There are ideas out there that this is something that could be done under the auspices of the OSCE, for instance. That this would have to be a format where Russia is part of a of a format that includes Belarusians from both the regime and the democratic movement, as well as Russia and Western partners. So there are ideas out there how this could be formatted. At the moment, this is being rejected by Alexander Lukashenko and his regime, as well as his supporters in the Kremlin. But that may not stay like this forever. So whatever the exact formats and timing, there is a possibility still for getting out of this crisis by way of some form of negotiation. And inevitably, in my opinion, this would lead to a more open Belarus. It would also be interesting for the Kremlin, because it was such a scenario would open more options for the Kremlin again to interfere in the country, place its own candidates, use its media muscle, use its pressure points and energy, finances, and so forth on developments in Belarus. But one broad scenario is a negotiation-based exit from this crisis. The other one is a basically freeze of the status quo, a closure of the country, a pacification of the situation by Alexander Lukashenko and his security apparatus, perhaps with Russian help, or almost inevitably with Russian help, even though this doesn't necessarily have to mean that Russian troops are going to march into Belarus. But this is basically a scenario whereby Belarus is being closed by the regime. Where there is military control, where there is a security apparatus that basically keeps Alexander Lukashenko fully in power, whereby you have restrictions on the movement of people, whereby you will eventually also have very high economic costs, because the economy of the country will suffer even more than they have already so far.
Yeah.
Some form of closure scenario, which may also last for quite some time, which may last a number of years. If you remember my Polish example, then the freeze of the situation in Poland basically lasted throughout the 80s. So what you have here is a second sort of negative scenario that means the country is closing in. It will be near impossible to engage with the country for Western powers. It will be fully under the fully sort of immersed in a one-sided relationship, basically with Russia as a guarantor of the status quo. And the ones who will be suffering this are obviously Belarusian society at large, because their civic life, their material conditions will deteriorate dramatically. And at the same time, this will do nothing to remove the collective experience of this summer from their heads. So they will be enemies of the or opponents of the government for as long as this regime is in place. So you can freeze, but you cannot this way, in a violent way, resolve the situation.
Thank you very much, Joerg, Dr. Forbrig, for this wonderful discussion. So with this positive outlook about the reversibility of democratization, about an open Belarusian society, and about the fulfillment of people's dreams on the street, and particularly the youth and also women, let us close this discussion. Thank you very much for this very insightful set of observations. And again, Thank you also on behalf of the Osteuropa-Institut of the Freie Universität Berlin. So this was Joerg Forbrig of the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.